Welcome to the March 16th, 2025 episode of The Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop, and today's working title is Can We Turn the Lights Out on Trump? I want to ask the question because Ontario Premier Doug Ford raised this. He said, look, we're going to do tariffs, and if you keep counter-tariffing us, I'm just going to shut off the electricity exports from Ontario to the United States. And Ontario is actually a very big power exporter to the New York, sort of northeast seaboard, so New England and New York. And there are other provinces. Quebec is a very large electricity exporter, so are Manitoba and BC. So I'm going to be talking to electrical engineer and power grid expert Scott Jansen, who I know very well from our Energy Circle conversations about this issue. So welcome to Energy Talks, or the Energy Show. I keep getting the show and the podcast mixed up, but welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Markham. Happy to be here.
Well, this is a fascinating conversation because we've talked on this show about how, in my opinion, our exports to the oil and gas exports, but particularly oil exports to the United States, actually makes them more vulnerable than we are when it comes to economic pressure, like tariffs. And electricity is the one thing that I think wasn't tariffed. It was exempted under Trump's executive order because I don't think he wants to get into that battle. I think that the Americans are vulnerable. And I wanted to talk to a grid expert to, find out if that in fact is true, what we can do. So before we get into the details, let's just talk about this at high level, kind of a 35,000 foot level. Can we we just flick the switch and shut off the exports?
So the tricky answer with all these, it's not a simple answer, but largely no. And in certain cases, yes. So what happens is the grid is very integrated. To use Trump's words in this negotiation, the US doesn't hold any of the cards on the electricity side. Generally, Canada controls it because of our hydro. We can control how much we produce and how much we don't produce, and then we can control what goes across the transmission lines, interprovincially and internationally. Now, the problem is with an AC transmission line, you essentially have to balance the load on each side's exactly in order to shut it off. If not, you're going to get a cascade failure. What will happen is it's like a giant dam just shutting off, or a giant source of energy shutting off, or a giant source of energy turning on immediately. It will cause ripple problems in the grid. So frequency will go down, and then you could see a bunch of motors shutting off, and then you could see blackouts happening.
Right. That happened a number of years ago in the New York area. They had a big blackout, and it was chaos there for a long time. And anytime I have an engineer on for an interview, the one thing I know is it will never be a simple answer.
No.
Right. And we do know from the work that we've done over the years here at Energy Media that the power grid is a very, very complex. In fact, it's often described as the world's biggest machine.
Yes.
And these are not to be treated disrespectfully. You can do a lot of damage if you don't mind your P's and Q's when you're managing and operating these. So let's talk about how a power grid works, because a lot of the folks that are watching probably don't know the basics of it. So maybe you can cover the basics of a power grid for us.
Actually, the power grid is probably the biggest, like you said, the biggest machine, but it's also the cooperation between the biggest amount of parties. So when we're talking about shutting off grids and everything, you have to have coordination on both sides to say, we're going to lower our generation at the same time you lower your load. So we have to coordinate it to balance it out. If you don't have both sides coordinated, you're going to have an imbalance, and electrons move at the speed of light. So electrons will go from wherever in the grid to it's generated to wherever it's needed, right? Essentially, energy will just flow anywhere in that grid, and the grid does not see borders. It just sees wires. So, go ahead.
Can you, is there any means, is there a switch somewhere, a substation, whatever, between, the United States and Canada? And I think we need to back up a little bit here because we don't have a power grid in Canada. We have 10 provincial power grids and 3 territorial power grids. We're very siloed. You and I both live in British Columbia, and the amount of electricity that gets traded to the east of us into Alberta, Saskatchewan, and other provinces is very small. I
Yeah.
mean, we're very isolated here. We do some trade north and south with California and Washington into the western region, and that's it. And the same holds true for Manitoba. Its trade is north and south into Minnesota and the Midwest. The same with Ontario and into the Midwest and the Northeast, and then Quebec would be almost all into the Northeast. So we really have 10 little islands for the most part in Canada. And their trade is going north and south, very little east and west. And is there a switch anywhere in that system where you can just flick it off and say, we're we're powering down the amount of electricity we're sending, say, hypothetically, from BC to California?
You're right. So there's three main grids. There's the Western electrical grid, there's the Central electrical grid, and then the Eastern electrical grid. And you're right, we're Canada's part of all three of those grids in North America, north and south. And those grids, particularly between Alberta and BC, there's only a DC connection. There is a switch there. Every time there's a DC connection, there is a switch. But you still need to balance the load before you throw the switch, or else literally sparks will fly. And between Manitoba and Ontario, there's a separation there too. So Saskatchewan and Manitoba are on their own, connected north and south. Alberta and BC, and then Ontario East is all connected on the Easter grid. So the answer to your question, there are a bunch of tiny switches. Ontario, when we're talking about the trade of power in between USA and Ontario, it's big, but on a grand basis, it's small. Quebec is the number one. Quebec has a bunch of DC lines that are coming down. So DC means that it goes from an AC, it has a substation, converts it to DC, and goes all the way down, converts it again. Those are easier to turn off without seeing a grid collapse, but it's like a giant load. It has to be planned.
Little fun fact for you. When I graduated high school in 1977, I went to work for Manitoba Hydro, way up in northern Manitoba. I worked on a converter station, and it was so old, it didn't have transistors to do the conversion. It had mercury arc valves. And folks, if you've probably never seen one of these things, but there were 12 of these valves, and at night, when everything was dark, they would arc. And it was like watching a horror movie, a Frankenstein movie, where the crazy, Tesla type arcing, and it was just wild. Anyway, but exactly. So the dam produces AC. We turned it into DC, sent it down to southern Manitoba, where it was turned back into AC. Okay, so does that mean that Quebec would be the better option? Like if we wanted to switch off as a trade measure, or God forbid, I mean, Trump, actually invades Canada and we have to take drastic measures, would Quebec be the logical place to shut off the juice?
Quebec and British Columbia would be the only ones that could turn down their generation fast enough. So that's the other thing to think about here is the balance is if you're exporting 1,000 megawatts, you have 5 minutes. Within 5 minutes on a dam, you can turn down 1,000 megawatts. There's really no other technology that can turn down and ramp up quicker than hydro dams. And then you can store. So you have to know and say, we have enough storage in our reservoirs that we're going to be holding back water. We're going to ramp down our generation just so we balance. And then at that point, we're going to turn off the switch on the DC side. Now, that's all fine on the DC side. That amount of switch and change on the Ontario system would probably cause localized blackouts. So again, it's very much like the tariffs that Trump is putting on. it actually hurts Ontario just as much as it hurts the Americans. That's why my advocation, I'd advocate for increasing export tariffs because it's easy. It's just a paper thing, but it doesn't have any physical implications.
Right. It's an export tax, and if it's 25%, then the Americans pay 25%, their bills go up.
Exactly.
But there's no interruption in the power, and the grids may work as they do. One of the things that's impressed me as I've learned about the North American electricity system is how interconnected the Canadian system is with the American system. And by the way, and this gets back to my point about who has leverage here in this relationship, the crude oil system and the natural gas systems that run from Canada into the US, it's exactly the same thing. They're
Exactly.
very, very interconnected. They were designed that way decades ago. They are maintained and regulated, for the maximum efficiency and lowest cost. You mess with those systems at your peril.
Absolutely. Yes, especially the gas pipelines. The gas is coming. You don't have anywhere to store it.
Right.
The difference is the hydro. You can store it in the reservoir for time to time. I mean, that's another key point in British Columbia. The Columbia River Treaty is trying to be renegotiated. There is no reason for Canada to renegotiate. Canada has all the cards. They control the headwaters. They get the generation, and they control the headwaters to the benefit of the U.S. dams. Right now, that's
Interesting. Can you give us a little more background on that?
yeah. So they built Canada built Mica, Revelstoke, and Le Pen Laurel Dam. So they built a series of dams on the Columbia because the Army Corps of Engineers in the States said we need control of these headwaters because we don't have enough reservoir space in the United States.
Right.
And we have the giant reservoir space. Mica Dam's reservoir comes all the way from Revelstoke all the way up to Jasper. So it's pretty much the majority of the province. And they could store, I just did some work on it. They could shut off power or the flow to the Columbia entirely for 88 days. Based on what the storage is, they could turn it off completely. That would damage the United States and ecosystems and everything. It wouldn't be a smart thing to do. But it's very much like it's a good way to think of how the electricity system works as well. Is you can't just stop the flow of electricity, just like you can't just stop the flow of water. You can for 88 days, but there's going to be problems in America and in the U.S. and in Canada, because in Canada, if we store all that water and we shut off the electricity, we won't have reservoir space. So at some point, we're going to have to turn it on, and you need somewhere for it to go.
So using the Columbia River as an example, we could not let the water through the dams. It backs up the reservoir. So now we've got a flooding problem because we've got these reservoirs that are growing. The Americans have got the opposite problem because now they've got no water. And if I remember correctly, the California farmers rely on the Columbia River quite extensively, don't they?
No. That is the Colorado River.
Oh, that's right, Colorado River. Sorry.
Yeah.
So what's downstream in the United States of the Columbia River? Is it primarily dams? They must use it for irrigation, for agriculture, I would think.
Yeah, dams. So Idaho, Washington, and Oregon use it for dams and irrigation. And salmon. There's a whole bunch of salmon spawning grounds that are on that. So you would completely wipe out some fisheries by doing that.
Right. Okay. So we're getting a sense here of the magnitude of the damage if, in a worst case scenario, Canada decided to do this. We have risks. The Americans have risks, and we'd have to make some kind of a determination whether the damage to us is worth inflicting the damage on the Americans. I mean, that sounds like very much a military planning exercise, which presumably has been done in Ottawa already by the Canadian Armed Forces. Okay, let's talk about the because this is something we've talked about on the Energy Circle, which is a group of energy professionals that Energy Media has put together, and we meet once a week and talk about issues just like this, and get expertise from people like yourself. So, and one of the subjects that's come up over and over again is the benefits that would accrue to Canada if we did more east-west trade. So let's say in Western Canada, we trade between BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And you have the bookend provinces with hydro, BC and Manitoba. And then in the middle, you have the prairie provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan, that have, the best wind and solar resources in the world. And the hydro and the renewables, the intermittent renewables, work really well together. Maybe you could explain how that works.
On what the benefits would be, but interconnections, right?
Right.
So right now, BC and Alberta are connected on one tiny line over in Crow's Nest Pass. That is curtailed because Alberta cannot take the amount of energy from there, because if they lose that line, and I mean, this illustrates the whole point entirely. Alberta says if we lose this transmission line immediately, let's say a lightning strikes it and it explodes, their grid will collapse. It will collapse because they don't have enough generation that can be ramped up quick enough to meet or to replace that imported electricity. So now if you have and this is just Alberta and BC, but now if you have a line at Crow's Nest Pass and then up near Fort St. John, you build another DC line over to Edmonton, what you have is an N-1 criteria. So if one fails, the other one matches that load.
Okay. So you basically have to build some redundancy into the system so that if there's a catastrophic failure, the system can
self-heal. Exactly.
Right. And for our American and, well, non-Canadian viewers, what Scott is talking about is the Canadian provinces go BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. And he's talking, when he says Fort St. John and up in that Peace River, it's up in the northeast part of British Columbia, not far from 400 kilometers from Edmonton, which is the capital of Alberta and a city of about just under 1 million people, just to give you a little geography and set the context here. Okay, so but interties could be built,
yeah,
that would resolve this issue. And the intermittent renewables, that means Alberta already has more than any other province. I think in 2022, they installed a gigawatt of renewable capacity. They were going to do 2 gigawatts in 2023. And then the Alberta government brought in a moratorium, and that's a whole different story for another day. But there is a tremendous amount of potential there. So the idea is that when you're trading, so you produce a lot of really cheap electricity when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, and so you export that to BC. Then BC either shuts off or greatly reduces the amount of water going through its dams and the amount of electricity it's generating because it's taking the cheap electricity from Alberta. And then when the sun goes down or the wind stops blowing, then the dams ramp up again and electricity flows into Alberta. Now, have I got that essentially correct?
Yeah, they balance each other off. One of the key framings here to put out here is the benefits of electricity accrue to the user of the electricity. That's where all the benefits, the majority of the benefits, not from the producer of the electricity. And generally, we've got that wrong. We think, hey, the producer of the commodity is a benefit. But just you see it, you'd rather buy the electricity and then use it for that productive purpose than just buy electricity and just heat outdoors for no reason. So what's interesting in this case, though, is if you have those interties, east and west, all across Canada, what you will have is a flattening of prices.
Oh, okay.
So the Alberta power pool has a range where prices can go up to $999 a megawatt hour. And most of the big producers like TransAlta bid in at like $5 a megawatt hour. That means they're guaranteed to sell their power, but they're bidding in at $5. That means it's the minimum, but it'll never go that low because everybody gets paid whatever the marginal rate is. So if it's at $900, TransAlta just makes a windfall of money. So it's a weird market in that way. But if you just had a giant connection to BC, that's enough power there that you would probably average out around somewhere around $40 to $50 Canadian per megawatt hour.
Right, and the equivalent of that is 4 to 5 cents a kilowatt hour, which is what consumers like us, when we look at our power bill, it's not in megawatt hours, it's in kilowatt hours, 4 to 5 cents. I think now we used to pay about 10 cents, 11 cents. Now we're paying 13 cents here in BC, something like that. So that gives
on the
you
residential rate, but you're paying about 6.2%, 6.2 cents per kilowatt hour on industrial rates.
Right, and we should point out that the Alberta is very unique. It has a lot of industry tied to the oil and gas and the petrochemical plants, upgraders. The Up in northern Alberta, the oil sands is probably Canada's biggest industrial project, and so 75 to 80% of the power that gets consumed in Alberta is from industry and business and commercial, not residential. Not the same in BC and the other provinces. So if we did this, then prices would come down.
Correct. So there is no utility that has an incentive to do this. The way it's set up now, the benefit is for the entire Canadian economy. And just like they did in the US, if you had the Army Corps of Engineers of Canada, I guess it would be the Royal Army Corps of Engineers, they could come in and they could build interties and then just have a tariff, a subsidized tariff. It's like building a highway. And then everybody benefits. I mean, the big losers on that would be the big utilities in Alberta, because they would never get windfalls anymore. That just would disappear.
Yeah, it's a good, and again, for non-Canadians, most aside from Ontario, which has got kind of a weird hybrid market system, Alberta is the only electricity market system in Canada. The rest are all crown corporations. So in BC, we've got BC Hydro, it's owned by the BC government, and you can go right across the country, and that's pretty much the same. I think Nova Scotia's got maybe a private company. Anyway, the norm is government-owned utilities, which gives us a whole different approach than the Americans have got. So what we've got here, Scott, is two scenarios. On the one hand, we've got a hypothetical worst case scenario: the U.S. Under President Trump invades Canada, and then all bets are off. We're not talking about efficiency. We're not talking about the lowest cost way of doing things. This is a crisis, and the military will decide if that's shutting off the tap to the U.S. is a good idea. But then there's the other idea of using the electricity domestically and trading more between the provinces. And you've introduced an idea that, I'll be honest, I haven't thought about before, and that is it's the consumer of the electricity that benefits, not the producer. And if we look at it that way, what that means is if we built this system and then we generated more electricity, we had low prices, it's clean, it's reliable. That is, as we often say at Energy Media, the foundation of the 21st century economy. And you can then attract all sorts of industries. Now, why do we have an aluminum industry in Canada? Because we have hydropower. That's the only reason why. And we provide like 56 or 58% of the United States aluminum for that very reason. Most of it in Quebec and a little bit in BC at Kitimat. And what other industries, like data centers? Imagine if we could combine hydro and intermittent renewables into this system we're talking about, and we also have a well-developed telecom infrastructure in Canada, and the data centers we could attract.
Yes.
That would be a good industry. And there are plenty of other manufacturing or processing, like smelting of critical minerals.
Yeah,
would require this. So there's a lot of opportunity that we should do. We should do this not just because the Americans are threatening, but it's in our own economic self-interest.
absolutely. Actually, data centers are probably the best example of how you can transmit energy or electricity without wires and without, well, I should say there are wires, but without high voltage wires and transmission, because what you're essentially doing is you're taking all the processing and putting it in a location. But say you were doing all that processing for Japan, that's like a virtual transfer of energy. The energy is used in Canada, it's the data center, but the data is then sent back to Japan, for instance. So you can actually, it's like having a transmission line of power, but having that power being used here in British Columbia is the smartest way to bypass tariffs, to build an industry in British Columbia. And we do have a problem right now in British Columbia. I've heard directly this is that the government wants to focus on making jobs. They don't want to focus on making money. And it's true, data centers make money with very few jobs. But what that directly means is that increased productivity. So what we've seen in the past in Canada is that we want to generate jobs, and we're not that concerned about how much money each job produces, which reduces productivity. So it's just a mindset here, is that all the governments and all our policies are aimed at creating jobs, not at creating money or being efficient.
Right. And our politicians here, federal ones anyway, have talked about the labor productivity issue because ours has been falling. The Americans has been growing now for a number of years, and labor productivity ultimately translates into per capita wealth. If you have low
Correct.
productivity, your wages are not going to be as high. And high productivity is one of the reasons why the American economy is as wealthy as it is. And Americans are as wealthy as they are. So this would be in part a response to that. But it just seems like there are so many benefits to the East-West trade. The least of, no, you shouldn't say the least of it, but a significant benefit to Canada would be less dependence on the Americans. I mean, this
Correct.
is what we've been talking about for the last, ever since Trump started making his tariff threats and annexation threats 2 months ago, is that we somehow need to build a different economy that is not as dependent on the US, trades east and west, trades to other partners through the East Coast and the West Coast, because the Port of Vancouver is very significant import-export. Same with the Montreal and the St. Lawrence Seaway and so on. So we have lots of coasts, lots of places we can build ports or expand ports, and if we can make more stuff, or I'll get back to Torsten Jackard, Dr. Torsten Jackard, economist from UBC, who came on this show, and he said the number one thing Canada can do to respond to Trump's tariff and economic pressure strategy is add value to our resources.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And electricity would play a big role in that, right?
Any raw product. I mean, this is another framing that I think is missed, is a trade deficit in commodities that the US has with Canada is a positive, because every company that buys that oil or electricity has made an economic decision that buying that oil or electricity is going to go into an input and we're going to make a profit on it. So if you have a trade deficit in commodities as a country, that means you have a bunch of healthy businesses. That's just the way it is.
We've talked about that many times out here, that the Americans don't even understand their own oil system, because what they do is they take the cheap crude, heavy crude from Alberta, which they pay, $50-$60 for, and they put them into their specially kitted refineries that handle heavy crude. Then the light sweet crude that they make in Texas or North Dakota or whatever, they sell that in Europe for $80 or $90 a barrel. I mean, who's getting ripped off here? Trump,
Or even think of them. I mean, the oil company converts it into gasoline or diesel. They sell it, they make a profit on it, and then these trucking companies take the diesel and then go around. Well, who makes the most profit? Well, it's actually the trucking companies that make the most profit out of this entire deal as a percentage of each amount of diesel or oil. So the value is in the end user always. That's the way markets work.
Okay, so another trend that's really important here is that we are in the process of electrifying the global economy. Now, you don't see that in Canada very often. It's not part of our national energy conversation because we already have a very low cost, reliable, clean grid. We're somewhere in like 84 to 87% zero emissions. 60% hydro, 17% nuclear, and then wind and solar has now got it up well past 80. And so there just hasn't been the pressure on us to decarbonize, to expand. It's not on our radar. But down in the U.S., where their grid is not reliable and a lot of it is not low cost, it's creaky, and they've had to try to fix it. They've tried to expand it. They're trying to decarbonize it. They're retiring coal plants. They're retiring nuclear plants. Some of them are retiring gas plants. They're trying to. It's chaos down there. It's just chaos. And I know this because I've sat on the U.S. Energy Association's journalist panel when they do these technical briefings, and we interview the utility executives and the system operator executives, and they're pulling out their hair. They're just pulling out their hair. It's not, here's another organization, North American Electricity Reliability Corporation, NERC, which you're very familiar with. And what did NERC say with its latest report in the fall? It said the system is really overloaded. We haven't got enough reserves. And this winter, or even this summer, if it's hot, there could be failures. There could be blackouts and grid failures. And a lot of it, the risk is in the US, not in Canada. I've got that correct, haven't I?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because we've actually sat on our laurels a little bit in Canada with a really well-designed system connected on the edge of the grid. And in British Columbia, again, a good point is from 2008 until 2024, the load increased 6.2%. So it's a it's almost a flat line where it hasn't increased because we've actively discouraged new industrial loads from coming in. It's been very difficult. You do that, and then you're going to have to balance the grid. But like you've heard on your program, virtual power plants are a big deal down in the States, putting batteries in locations, balancing the grid, and Canada is just getting their minds around it right now. So these are things that have to happen. They're going to have to move forward. And then one other point about just electricity and energy and electrification. We're looking at 68% of the energy that is produced in North America is wasted. On Sankey diagrams, it just goes to heat and losses. Converting transportation from fossil fuels to electricity increases the efficiency by 300%. So you get about a 30% efficiency on fossil fuels, 85 to 90% on battery electric vehicles. So if we electrify everything, we don't need to produce as much energy to meet the same demand.
We addressed this on the a podcast with Professor Nick Eyre from Cambridge because he's done some seminal work on this, and he has some great diagrams that show when you're doing it with a fossil fuel, so coal, oil, or gas. You first of all, the energy has to be combusted. You have to combust that fuel to create energy in a device like you make gasoline out of oil, then you combust it in an internal combustion engine, and then the engine then makes work that you drive a car or you create electricity or whatever you do with it. But the combustion part of it is so inefficient that you get like 20, 25, maybe 30% of the energy out of that fuel, and the rest is lost in heat. It comes out of the block of your car, goes out the exhaust in your car, but there's just so much energy in the gasoline, like it's incredibly energy dense that we kind of make it work, but it's not efficient. Whereas, as you mentioned, like electric motors, it's like 85, 90, maybe even 95% efficient. So you get some line losses and you get some losses here and there. So it's not 100%, but it's way higher. And efficiency translates into greater productivity, which translates into greater economic competitiveness and into lower costs.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's what we're talking about here. So Trump's threats and our advantageous position in the sort of national the electricity systems of the two countries not only gives us leverage over the US, but it also gives us the opportunity to very quickly build an east-west economy that is much more efficient, much more competitive, generates more value, more jobs, more profit, more productivity for everybody, and then we get to play in the global market instead of playing in with exporting 75% of uh, our economy into the U.S. I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about here.
Absolutely. There's another point here with electricity and export tariffs. PricewaterhouseCoopers, I was on a on a webinar with them talking about the tariffs, and they used a word just called transfer pricing. This is a really good opportunity for Canada to put export tariffs and transfer pricing. So, in essence, you could put a, let's say, 100% tariff on electricity, and then you could sell tariff-free quotas to customers. So essentially what's showing is the market value of the electricity they're buying is zero. So Trump's tariffs, where if he has them, that just makes the value of the product zero. And then there's no tariff. The US government doesn't have to pay. The US customer doesn't have to pay the US government. The US customer pays the Canadian government. The Canadian government issues these quotas to provinces. Provinces collect the money, and it's just a way of transferring, saying, hey, you're buying and selling quotas, you're not buying and selling electricity. Well, you can't tariff a quota, you can't tariff a subscription fee.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay, so what you brought up is one way to get around the tariffs and to have a more efficient system.
Yes.
And I would imagine there are clever economists in government, outside government, universities, and consultants like PwC who are thinking up ways to get around this and to make it work. And so that's great. Um, but if we do too much, if we put too much eggs in that basket, essentially all we're doing is perpetuating the system we already have. And I think we've agreed that while that system has worked really well, things are changing at the global level. The global economy is changing. And economies like Canada need to do things differently. As Torsten Jackert said, add value to your resources. So this is a moment in time where we can tinker with the existing system to make it kind of sort of work and to respond to Trump, or we can come in for a whole new rethink that we've never had the pressure before to do that. We've never had the political pressure to do it. And so our politicians have taken the path of least resistance and they've just kept on with the status quo. And I am of the opinion that now is the time for the radical rethink. Now is the time to say, hey, we can escape our old hewers of wood, drawers of water, the Staples thesis, and we can do something that will set us up for the rest of the century to be as prosperous as we've ever been, or even more prosperous.
Absolutely. Nation building. Like the fact
Yeah,
that we built, as a nation, we built a pipeline, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, at a huge expense and way over the cost. And I think it was initially planned to be 11 billion, but it ended up as like 34 billion, something like that. Might even be more when you add it up. You can build an intertie between BC and Alberta that would be more than adequate for all the power going back and forth for about $5 billion.
right.
It's a steal of a deal. It'll actually transmit more energy than Trans Mountain Pipeline does, and it'll do it instantaneously at the speed of light. Um, we need the government to step up. I mean, it has to be a federal government because there are, even BC Hydro doesn't really benefit from that at all.
Right. And a couple, 3 years ago, the Liberal government of Justin Trudeau, who's just stepped down, and we now have a new Prime Minister, Mark Carney. But the Liberal government put in a program that would either pay some or all of building those interties. So the idea of this has been around for like decades. This is not a new idea. And the government has put programs in place that have never been taken advantage of. The money just kind of sits there, I guess. And what was lacking was the political will. The politicians in the various provinces have never wanted to put this on the table because there are, like you say, it doesn't benefit the utilities, which are owned by government. It doesn't, where's the direct benefit to them? They're not interested in it. They want to create jobs, not wealth. And so we now that we've shaken things up, actually, maybe we should send a card to Donald Trump and thank him for
Well,
for
this is
getting. Yeah, go ahead.
this is the issue with infrastructure. It's concentrated capital cost and very distributed and diverse benefits or dispersed benefits. And now I really like the idea. I think pushing forward the idea of a tie, another northern tie between Alberta and BC, is a really good concrete thing to push for. I think the Treaty 8 First Nations should be on board with that. That would be the ideal because that is their territory. And then you would just say, Treaty 8 First Nations, you build it. There's the price for it. And then you have to have the federal government buy it or something because it has to be a separate entity. Otherwise, you're just going to put costs and tariffs on there that will make the intertie too expensive to use.
Right, and the federal government does have some constitutional jurisdiction here because anything that flows across a border is regulated by the federal government, not the provincial government. So it can use that power, and of course, the power of the big red checkbook, as I like to call it, they can provide subsidies and build this kind of infrastructure. We've also seen the idea floated, though it's not popular yet, of a federal crown corporation that could actually do the trading back and forth across the provinces if that maybe that would work, maybe it wouldn't work. But what we're seeing, I guess, out of this conversation, Scott, if I could just wrap it up as we come to the end of the interview, is that we have lots of options. There's this trading option that PwC floated that would basically get around the tariffs and maintain the status quo. There's the emergency, turn off the switch if under very dire circumstances. There's building an east-west system, which insulates us from the American economic pressure, plus builds a better economy for Canada. It would really be a nation-building kind of exercise because you'd have to do it right across the country, between the four western provinces, between Ontario and Quebec, and then the Atlantic Loop, the four maritime provinces, as it's called. We might see a period of prosperity here that we haven't seen in a long time.
And actually, to point out, actually, Manitoba and Saskatchewan are doing quite well. Manitoba is actually supplying the majority of the power for northern sections of Saskatchewan. They're more on the Manitoba grid than they are the Saskatchewan grid. And it makes sense, and you can see that kind of seep in, but they're not a fully interconnected grid yet. And that would be ideal for both provinces.
Right. And so we need the federal government to come in here and be the catalyst to get everybody talking and sort of grease the wheels with some money to make it happen. Scott, this has been fascinating. Frankly, the conversation went in the direction I didn't think it would go. We started off with the negative, what happens if there's a crisis and we have to flick switches and so on. What are the dangers to that? And then we kind of evolved into what are the positives that could come out of this? And I think that the positives are actually overwhelm the negatives.
They are. And I think to end it on framing, if we can get everybody to frame the fact that the customer, the end user of electricity, is the beneficiary of electricity. Manitoba had for years a policy that they wanted to discourage electricity use, industrial electricity use in the province so that they could prioritize exporting electricity to the US. And that is just not a smart way to do things. You should be encouraging people to set their business up in Manitoba because the benefits from that business are always multiples of what the cost of electricity is.
Cheap, reliable, clean electricity will attract capital and investment in things like plants and factories and so on. We've seen that over and over around the world. Unfortunately, Canadians don't pay attention. We're a little better than Americans, but not much at paying attention to what's going on in other regions of the world like China and Europe. Anyway, Scott, thank you very much for this fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching the show. We are on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers and over 1 million views. If you're enjoying the content, give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being part of our community.